Welcome, everyone, to this explainer. Today we are unpacking two incredibly rich foundational texts that really dig into the nitty-gritty of belief, community, and where we truly belong. We're going to be looking directly at a passage from the letter of St. Paul to the Ephesians, and then we'll pair it with a deeply human, honestly pretty dramatic narrative from the Gospel according to John. So we're essentially breaking down how these sources describe the construction of faith, taking it all the way from this grand structural concept down to a deeply personal, intimate struggle. Let's get right into it.
We are skipping any kind of formal agenda today and plunging straight into the central tension of these texts. We're dealing with two massive, lingering questions here. First, how do totally disconnected strangers actually transform into a unified, sacred temple? And second, when it comes down to true, unshakable conviction, is seeing really believing? Both of our texts deal with the foundation of faith, but they come at it from entirely different angles. One uses these sweeping architectural metaphors, while the other leans hard into gritty, skeptical human experience. So let's explore how they connect.
Part 1. From Strangers to Citizens.
Okay, let's dive right in. We'll kick things off with our first text, Paul's letter to the Ephesians. Now, this source focuses heavily on a universal shift, like a radical transition from being totally isolated to finding absolute rooted belonging. Ephesians starts by describing early believers as strangers and sojourners. Now, a sojourner is basically a temporary resident. Think of someone just passing through, someone who doesn't have permanent roots, rights, or a true home in the place they're standing. The text is really establishing a baseline of vulnerability here. These early believers, they're starting out completely unrooted.
But here is the massive pivot. We start with that before state, right? The disconnected strangers and sojourners. But then the text flat out declares that they are no longer that. Suddenly they are elevated to fellow citizens with the holy ones and members of the household of God. I mean, that is a profound shift in status. You're going from being temporary and alienated to permanent and intimately connected. It's not just like they were handed a passport. They were brought directly into the family living room. They are now part of a spiritual household.
Part 2. The Architecture of Faith. So, having established this new household, the text doesn't just stop at family dynamics. It introduces these really concrete visual metaphors to describe exactly how this massive community is constructed, and it brilliantly illustrates a precise three-part architectural blueprint. First up, you need a solid foundation, the literal ground everything rests on, which is identified here as the apostles and prophets. Next, you've got the most critical structural element holding the arches together, the capstone. The text explicitly names Christ Jesus himself as this capstone bearing the ultimate weight. And finally, there's the structure itself. The text says that in him you also are being built together. The believers themselves are the bricks and mortar filling out this grand design.
The text wraps up its architectural metaphor by explaining the ultimate purpose of all this construction. Through that capstone, the entire structure is held together and grows into a temple sacred in the Lord. It culminates in this genuinely beautiful idea, a dwelling place of God in the Spirit. The transition is entirely complete. Those temporary sojourners we talked about, they've become the very building blocks of a permanent, sacred dwelling.
Part 3. The Anatomy of Doubt.
But how does a person actually become one of those building blocks? Like, how is that foundation of faith built in the mind of an individual? To answer that, we're going to pivot over to our second source, the Gospel of John, to look at the gritty reality of doubt. The text introduces a highly specific scenario involving one of the 12, Thomas, who is also called Didymus. And the critical detail here is his absence. Jesus had come to the disciples, but Thomas was simply not with them. So when he finally returns, the others excitedly proclaim, "We have seen the Lord." Thomas is suddenly faced with secondhand information about a miraculous event he completely missed out on.
Now, what's so fascinating is Thomas's reaction. He doesn't just express mild skepticism, he essentially demands the ancient equivalent of "picture it didn't happen." He sets strict, unyielding physical conditions for his faith. He demands empirical proof, and it is highly visceral. He needs to see the marks of the nails. He needs to physically put his finger into those nail marks and place his hand into his side. According to the text, he definitively states, "I will not believe unless these exact, tactile criteria are met." This right here is the anatomy of doubt laid completely bare, a refusal to accept the extraordinary without undeniable physical evidence.
And then the text builds the tension by giving us a timeline. Think about the agonizing gap here. Day 1 happens, Jesus appears, and Thomas misses it. Then an entire week passes. A whole week of the other disciples celebrating while Thomas sits in his absolute doubt, just waiting. Finally, a week later, the text tells us the disciples are inside again, and this time, Thomas is present. And then, a really crucial detail to set the scene. The doors were locked. Despite this physical barrier, Jesus comes and stands in their midst.
Part 4. Seeing versus believing. This brings us to the absolute climax of the narrative, where the intense tension of human doubt meets the sudden, undeniable culmination of faith. The very first thing Jesus does after bypassing those locked doors and standing among his totally startled disciples is offer a simple, powerful greeting. He says, "Peace be with you." It's a profound moment. He doesn't begin with a reprimand, he begins by diffusing the tension in the room and offering peace to the very people who are hiding behind locked doors.
Let's see how this tension breaks. Jesus turns his attention entirely to Thomas and methodically answers every single demand from a week prior. Step 1, put your finger here and see my hands. Step 2, bring your hand and put it into my side. He offers the exact empirical, tactile proof that Thomas requested. And then, step 3, he offers the directive that shifts everything. Do not be unbelieving, but believe. Faced with the exact physical proof he demanded, Thomas's reaction is immediate and absolute. The text gives us his response in just 5 awestruck words: "My Lord and my God." All the visceral conditions he laid out are instantly shattered by the reality standing right in front of him. This is the moment the text showcases his profound and ultimate realization of faith. The skeptic is entirely convinced. So the crucial point here is how Jesus responds to Thomas's sudden declaration, because it completely reframes the entire concept of faith for everyone else. Jesus responds by defining 2 distinct types of belief. First, there's Thomas's belief, which is heavily reliant on physical proof. Have you come to believe because you have seen me? But then, Jesus defines a second, entirely distinct category. Blessed are those who have not seen and have believed. This overarching message spans out from that locked room to address future generations, those who must build their faith on the testimony of others, without the benefit of putting their hands in the nail marks.
And that brings us right back to where we started. Whether it's the grand structural vision of being built into a sacred dwelling place from the letter to the Ephesians, or that intimate, locked-room struggle between doubt and empirical proof in the Gospel of John, both texts force us to examine the actual mechanics of faith. Are you demanding to see the foundation before you trust the structure? What actually forms the foundation of your belief? It's a lingering question drawn directly from the core of these texts, and one that leaves us all to reflect on the architecture of our own convictions. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer.